So to give you an overview of what I'll be talking about, this is the broad outline. I'm going to start with approach and motivation, describe the studies that I'm going to present data on today, and of course, talk about findings and implications. So let's dive right in. Now, as many of you know, and as Nicole mentioned, my own research around decision-making and behavior change has taken me across a number of academic disciplines during my time here, including health sciences, so public health, the social sciences, and management scholarship. Physically, it's also taken me in a lot of different places. So one of my chapters of my dissertation, in collaboration with Priya, took me traipsing around the Bay Area, trying to figure out why teenagers make decisions that they do, and why blue Gatorade is no longer in vogue. Here I am. It's also meant that I've spent hours talking to MBA students, trying to understand what they know about corporate sustainability. And in some of the more aside projects, I've spent a lot of time in bathrooms at Stanford, trying to understand if we can get people to reduce their paper towel usage. So again, here I am. If anybody had any doubts, I'm definitely in research for the glamour. So overall, what's led me to all of these projects is the same thing that drew me to E-IPER in the beginning, this philosophy that we should seek out important and meaningful questions. Then the program gives us the license to use whatever tools we can to solve it. So be it experiments, interviews, surveys, or really anything else. But actually, the story that I'm going to tell you today started before I even came to graduate school. And it started when I was at the World Bank, before coming here, when I was working for the Africa Division on Environment and Resources. So I'm getting ready to leave and come to Stanford. And one of my mentors there, Dinesh, asked me, Jen, after you finish, do you want to come back to the bank? And I said, I'm not sure. Over my time at the bank, I had started to see how the private sector was becoming an increasingly big player when it came to global sustainability issues. So Dinesh asks me this question. He says, Jen, who do you think is our biggest competitor nowadays in Africa? This is a rhetorical question, so I just let him continue. And then he said, you might think that it's the other regional banks that we're competing with. That was the case for a long time. But that's no longer true. Today, our biggest competitor is the private sector. And whoever wins this competition gets to determine the social and environmental standards of these projects and gets to determine how development gets done. So, young grasshopper, follow the money, he says. So, with those words ringing in my head, I turned in my diplomatic visa, I head to Stanford and hang out in bathrooms. But more seriously, what Dinesh was referring to is this group of activities that encompass the interactions between the private sector and the environment. And as this has become more prevalent in society today, you might have heard a number of terms, such as some of the ones that I'm putting here. For the talk today, I'm actually going to use the term corporate environmental performance to refer to this group of activities. And of course, academically, we have a definition, the business activities that encompass environmental management performance and environmental operational performance. But practically speaking, I'm really referring to any interaction between businesses that might affect the environment or might lead businesses to be affected by the environment. Now, corporate environmental performance has obviously been around for decades, but the topic has actually gone through a sea change, especially in the last few years, that has been redefining the relationship between the private sector and the environment. So this New York Times article from 2014 really started to outline how companies like Coca-Cola were starting to take climate change seriously as an economically disruptive force that could affect GDP, cause higher commodity costs, result in broken supply chains, and increased financial risk overall. In 2015, we had a watershed moment internationally where business leaders for the first time were invited to sit alongside government leaders at the international climate change negotiations. And then in 2016, in a survey of over 1,000 CEOs around the world, 49% of them said that they believe that business will be the single most important actor in delivering sustainable development goals. So it's increasingly clear that there is a role for the private sector. Now, if you're somebody like me who cares about these issues, where do you even begin? At some point, you have to start asking yourself, where do these leaders come from? And as I started to look around and was talking to people, I realized that even though the world of business itself is vast, every year, hundreds and thousands of future business leaders gather at business schools with a cohort of peers to gain knowledge and skills. So if we want to understand how businesses operate and why they operate in the way that they do, what better place than to go to the classrooms where they're learning these knowledge, skills, and ideas about what it actually means to be a business leader. Indeed, a lot of the research has shown that business schools serve as this essential gatekeeper in the professional pipeline, creating networks that then replicate beyond the business school experience. These network effects are even more important when you think about how popular the MBA degree is. So over the last 40 years, the number of MBAs awarded in the US has grown by 600%, and the number of CEOs with MBAs has also grown significantly. And finally, researchers have shown that the MBA degree has been found to affect future behavior, along things including corporate environmental performance, but also things like self-serving behavior, which I will refer to later. So we know that business schools are the strategic and high-impact site for potential intervention. We also know that when it comes to trying to address sustainability within a business context, it requires proactive action that has to be grounded with new skills and knowledge that isn't being currently taught. Unfortunately, my own experience talking to business school students early in my time at graduate school corroborated what management scholars have been talking about for decades, which is that when it comes to sustainability, MBAs are ill-prepared to address these issues or bring them up in their workplaces. So this gap between the private sector need for involvement and then these individual attitudes of MBA students is what first captured my attention. And I really wanted to understand what was going on, both because of the potential impact, but also because if we want to design interventions, we need to first understand what is actually going on the ground. And so I sought to answer two main questions. First, how do business students understand their role and responsibility for addressing corporate environmental performance? And then secondly, how does the business school experience shape these views? Now you'll notice that I'm focusing on role and responsibility. Why? Well, previous research tells us that our role expectations, or how we define our roles, really shapes what we think is necessary or expected within our jobs. And in addition, we know that our perceptions of our roles, both in our personal and professional lives, are impacted by a combination of individual and situational factors. Now you can think about this for yourself, of course. How you think about your own responsibilities within your job is shaped not only by your own beliefs, but of course what you see from those around you. So when you see other people taking certain actions or behaviors, especially if they have a similar position to you. So we know that individual and situational factors affect role expectations. They also affect corporate environmental performance behaviors. And this actually tracks with two lines of research that scholars in management have looked at. The first is looking at corporate environmental performance behaviors as driven by these internal values and ideologies. So a lot of this work had looked at people who might have pro-environmental values to begin with, and then what happens when they go into organizations. The other line of research is looking at corporate environmental performance behaviors as being driven by external features or features within an organization. So some of this research has looked at, for example, how corporate environmental performance behavior changes if employees see it as an obligation versus an opportunity, or how these behaviors may even be influenced by things like how charismatic you perceive your organizational leader to be. Now, I'm going to come back to these ideas later in the talk, but one thing I wanted to point out is that depending on what you think drives corporate environmental performance behavior can have significant implications on organizational strategy. So for example, if you think that it's more of the first, you might want to populate your organization with more people who already have these values. But if you think that it's more of the second, then you might want to be very thoughtful about how you think about structuring an organization and the incentives within that organization. Ultimately, though, the reason we really care is that one external factor that can also affect our perceptions is our perceptions of other people. And the reason that we really care about this is that, of course, we're influenced by our own beliefs and feelings, but what we see others around doing can affect things like our feelings. For example, our feelings about efficacy or our ability to do things, commitment, even our ethical standards, as well as particular behaviors. So things like seeking out more information, whether or not we talk to other people about issues, and whether or not we really put down social support and advocacy for things that we care about. A lot of this work has been done with climate change and talking about climate change, but you can imagine that in the setting of corporate environmental performance, it's really important to have these feelings and behaviors in the right direction. Now, within these types of social influence, so how other people can affect our feelings and behaviors, there are two phenomena that I want to focus on today. The first one is that of pluralistic ignorance. And so what pluralistic ignorance is really talking about is when we misperceive the norm. So to give you an example, let's say you're sitting in a classroom and you think of a question, but you're worried that this question might be a little silly. This has never happened to me, but I've heard that it happens. So as you're trying to decide whether or not you're going to ask this question, one thing you might do is you might look around the room and see if anybody else has their hand raised. And when you see that nobody else is raising their hand, you might assume that nobody else has any questions. That is probably not the case. And so this is an example of pluralistic ignorance where people's external behaviors and cues may not actually be reflecting their internal feelings and their state of mind. The other effect I want to talk about is false consensus. So whereas pluralistic ignorance was about misperceiving the norm, false consensus is more about benchmarking your estimation of the norm on your own beliefs. So again, an example, let's say I were to ask you to tell me what you think everybody's favorite flavor of ice cream is in here. So what's the most popular flavor of ice cream? Well, you might think that your own favorite flavor of ice cream is more prevalent and more popular in this group than is actually the case. So that's an example of false consensus. So we know that our perceptions of others can influence our own perceptions and feelings, which can then in turn affect our actions. And this is especially important for corporate environmental performance because in order for people to act on this, they need to see it as relevant. So even people who might be sympathetic to these issues before they enter an organization, if they don't see these as relevant to their job, they're likely to have blind spots and fail to act. And given that we know that individuals play a critical role in pushing corporate environmental performance across organizations, getting people to recognize this as part of their job might be a critical link if we want to get more private sector engagement. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to show you results from two studies. One was a global study of MBA students, and the second one was an in-depth interview study with students at one campus. And really what I'm going to propose today is that when it comes to creating change and trying to engage the private sector on environmental sustainability, we, both sustainability folk and business schools, are missing a critical opportunity. The first opportunity is to give and expose students to these types of issues when they're at this critical juncture in their professional careers. And the second is that in the absence of deliberate and thoughtful intervention, the social and institutional settings of business schools may actually reinforce notions about what it means to be a business professional that will make it harder for these future business leaders to actually engage. In other words, inaction in this setting is not neutral. Okay, so I've mentioned these two studies. What are they? So the first study is a global survey of MBA students. And this was conducted with a lot of collaboration with a number of partners, including the Yale Center for Business and the Environment, and in particular, Laura Franceschini and Stuart DeCue, as well as partners such as the Global Network for Advanced Management, which is a network of business schools around the world, and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. So to develop this survey, we developed it between June and September of 2015, and then actually collected data between September and October. And we pre-tested with a number of MBA students from different regions. And what this survey is meant to be is a descriptive global snapshot on a scale that had never been captured before. So it's not meant to be a weighted sample of the full MBA population. But nonetheless, we implemented a number of measures to try to increase response rates and reduce respondent bias. So things like when we were distributing the survey, we crafted a number of template emails and then ensured that the survey distribution happened through official channels for all of our schools to standardize across schools. And secondly, when we were describing the survey, we didn't say specifically that it was about the environment or about climate change, but said that it was more broadly about the business school experience. Overall, the mean response rate by school was 24%. And while there is some variation in response rate, the thing to note here is that overall, with the findings I'm going to show you today, they don't change when we break it down by different response rates, for example. Now, another reason to do a global survey is, of course, to see if there are regional differences. So I get asked this all the time when I talk about this data, are there differences? And what I'm going to do today is I'm actually not going to show you the regional breakdowns. And that's, again, because the findings are similar across regions. This is an interesting finding unto itself, but I'm happy to discuss this more during questions. So whereas a survey gives us a really broad snapshot of what's going on in the world, any one of us who has designed a survey or taken a survey, hopefully everybody, will know that one of the big methodological limitations is that you can't go to a respondent and say, well, why did you answer that? Or what did you mean? Even though you may really want to. Okay. So to go deep, we need a different approach. And that's why for my second set of data, I interviewed a set of 60 MBA students from the same class in order to hear things from their perspective and in their own words. So for this set of data, I developed the interview protocol actually based on a previous project with a number of MBA students where we did interviews with 32 other students. And from this, developed an interview protocol that was about 60 minutes long and covered 3 main topics: the MBA experience itself, their perceptions of corporate environmental performance, and then finally, their views about responsibility, both as an MBA student and also in the world of business writ large. After transcribing all of the interviews, I went through multiple rounds of coding as the analytical technique. And I think one thing to note about this is in terms of survey collection, data collection, all of these interviews were conducted within the last 6 weeks of the MBA experience in order to maximize exposure of this experience on these students. The choice of campus itself was also deliberate. This is a campus that's well known for providing a number of sustainability resources and initiatives, but importantly, all of these are optional, which provided a variation in engagement across the sample. So over the course of a few months, I sent hundreds of emails to MBAs, set up so many meetings, and then would show up to this little room with my interview protocol and my recorder, and then waited for students to show up. And once they did, we would start talking. So these are students who are on the cusp of this one experience and about to embark on the next step of their professional journeys. And like many MBA students, this was a very ambitious group. So just to give you a sense, just under 60 of these MBA, just under half of these 60 MBA students said that within the next 10 years, they wanted to become a CEO or a founder of a company. And another 10 said that within 10 years, they wanted to be a VP or at least in the C-suite. So with this opportunity to really speak with these future business leaders, I wanted to know, first of all, why did they decide to come to business school? What was their experience here like? And then finally, in terms of corporate environmental performance, what had they talked about? What had they seen? And what did this all mean to them? So for the rest of the presentation, I'm going to layer the findings from these 2 studies. But I also wanted to give you just a broad sense of the characteristics of these samples next to each other. So overall, the population, as you would expect with MBA students, was the majority male and on average about 30 years old. And then I'm going to show you a number of other characteristics that you might think would affect the findings that I'm going to show you. But again, overall, these don't seem to have these don't create meaningful differences when we split the sample. Overall, what I want you to take away from this is that even though these 2 methods have critical differences and these samples are different in many ways, the findings from both of these studies point in a converging direction about the influence of MBA programs on students. All right, findings. So Given that these business students have so much decision-making power and so much access to resources in the future, one of the big questions that I want to start with and establish first is, who do these future business leaders see as responsible for protecting the environment? So to get at this and to examine this question, in the survey, this was one of the questions that we presented to every single person. Whose responsibility is it to ensure that companies are not harming the environment, companies themselves, or governments? So having seen this, then I told students, what is your opinion? Please pick the point on the scale below that best represents your opinion. Now what I'm going to show you here are the results bucketed into 3 categories. So students who thought it was more the responsibility of business, students who think that it's more the responsibility of government, and then those who think that the responsibility ought to be more shared. And overall, what you can see from these results is that actually the majority of students think that it should be shared, about 71%. And there's a slightly higher percentage of people who think that it's government responsibility. But overall, what I want you to take away from this is the general shape of the distribution. So keep that in mind. So we know that now we know what people's own perceptions are, but as we've seen, the perceptions of others can also influence our beliefs and in particular our behaviors. So let's look at that next. We start with the same prompt as before, but this time, instead of asking people for their own opinions, I ask them, what do you think is the opinion of most business students at your school? So what we're trying to ask now is what they think the majority of their classmates on their own campuses think. So I'm going to show you similar results to before. So this is what I had just shown you before, just spread out a little bit. And now I'm going to fill in these blanks with what students reported as what they thought the majority of their peers thought. So here are the results. And I want you to take 2 things away from this finding. So the first is that, on the whole, students are actually basically accurate in their perceptions of the norm. So you can see here that the majority of students perceived that their classmates also thought that it should be equally, that the responsibility should be shared. So in terms of pluralistic ignorance, what we're saying here is that there actually doesn't seem to be that much on average. People are accurately perceiving the shape of the distribution and the mode. However, at the same time, there's a systematic bias towards thinking that more students actually support government responsibility, and you can see that in the significant difference here. And so while this isn't a case of absolute pluralistic ignorance, what we see is a form of relative pluralistic ignorance where people are accurately perceiving the mode or the majority, but there is a skew in this distribution. So one question you might ask here is, well, is this skew evenly distributed? Where is it coming from? So to examine this further, I'm going to take each category and break it down. So what I'm going to show you here are the people's perceptions of the norm by their own responses. So first, we're going to look at people who responded for themselves that they thought that businesses and governments ought to share responsibility. And what we can see here is that on the whole, they're actually pretty accurate at estimating what others in their communities think. So the majority of them also think that the majority of their classmates think that it should be equal responsibility. And this is pretty close to the actual reported opinion across the population. But now let's look at the other 2 sides. So I'm going to start by showing you the responses of those who think that it's more the responsibility of business. So here we're starting to see a different distributional shape. These students who for themselves report that they think that businesses should take more responsibility, the majority of them still think that, yeah, indeed their peers think that it's equal responsibility, but now we see a little bit of false consensus happening. So the red line is what the actual percentage was in the population, and you'll see that if you're somebody who thinks that it's the responsibility of business, you're much more likely to think that your views are more represented in the population than is actually the case. When we look at those who think that it's the responsibility of government, we see a similar trend. Again, we see false consensus occurring here where they think that their opinions are more prevalent than is actually the case. So one question, especially as a social scientist thinking about perceptions of others, is where are people getting these perceptions from? And why is it that the people on the extremes are more skewed than the people in the middle? Is it just false consensus? Is it something else? So one thing you might think about is, how do we know what's actually important to people? One way is that we talk to them, and this is a form of external cue that gives us a sense of the norm. So how much are students actually talking about this? To examine, I'm going to turn again to the survey data, and another question that I asked was, how frequently would you say that you engage in conversations with other people about environmental sustainability? And what you see here is that on the whole, students are not having many conversations. So about 10% of students are never talking about this, about 44% are talking a few times a year, and then the rest of the students are talking once a month or more. And I just want you to compare this to the fact that when I do another sub-analyses of students who profess environmental concerns or are doing joint degrees with environmental degrees, about 90% of them say that they're talking about it once a week or more. So it's not that it's not possible on a business school campus, it's just not happening for the majority of students. This result also bears out in the qualitative data, where many students just told me they're not having these conversations. So Emma is somebody who came to business school after working in the hospitality industry for a number of years. And she told me how grateful she was for all of the relationships she had developed at business school, especially given how unique all of her classmates were. So when I asked her to give me an example of when she might have talked about corporate environmental performance or any sustainability topics, this is what she told me. I'm trying to think if there's anyone who's in climate change. I want to say yes, but the fact that there's not a name coming to mind, that leaves an indication. When asked, other students also had difficulty thinking of example. Here's what Susan told me. I have a feeling that other people don't think about it that much. I'm a fairly sociable person and I talk to a lot of people. If we never, then maybe people never talk about it. Although I secretly hope that's not true. So like Emma and Susan, most students said that they weren't talking about these issues with their peers. But even within this, you might want to think, okay, are some students talking about it more than others? Is there a difference among these different opinion types that we were talking about before? And so what I'm going to show you here is, again, turning back to the survey data, the 3 opinion types that I had laid out before, and then the percent of them that said that they engaged in these conversations once a month or more. And what we can see here is that actually not all of these groups are talking about it at the same rate. So about 10% more students who think that it's the responsibility of business are actually engaging in these conversations, as opposed to those who think that it's more the responsibility of government. And this is interesting because we know that in both of these extreme groups, they're exhibiting false consensus, but it's clear that maybe it's something going on that's different between these two groups, as one group is actually talking about it more than the other. So I want to zoom in on this group in particular, those who think that it's more the responsibility of government. And the reason is that if they're not talking about it, where are they getting these ideas from, right? So in the absence of conversation, where are they getting their ideas from? And if they're not checking it against other people, how accurate are their ideas? So in these interviews, I had the opportunity to ask students what they were really thinking. So Thomas was somebody who had worked for a number of years before coming to business school. After a while, he felt like he had reached a glass ceiling, and so he had come back to business school to gain new skills and exposure to new industries. So when I asked him why he thought that people might engage in corporate environmental performance, this is what he told me. The 2 main drivers, I think, of people engaging in business is money and passion. Some people engage in business to make a lot of money, and the other people engage in business because there's something that they really want to do with their life, and they just pursue that. Aaron, another student, an international student who had worked at a global consumer goods product company, told me this. Usually, at least from what I've seen in my career, sustainability means higher costs and not higher rewards. You really have to try to proactively explain why you're trying to do something like that. So what students like Aaron and Thomas told me was that they perceived corporate environmental performance as coming at a trade-off. A trade-off both in terms of profit, but also, as Aaron suggests here, in terms of legitimacy as a professional. It came at the cost of appearing to be a business professional. And because they didn't see corporate environmental performance as being as relevant to their roles, these students felt like in order to engage to justify engagement with corporate environmental performance, they had to use something other than professional motivation. So this has implications for these students in terms of who they see as being responsible for these issues. So Ardoin was somebody who hoped to, after business school, to go into finance and become a portfolio manager. And while he himself was not interested in corporate environmental performance, this is how he described the role within organizations. I think that in small businesses, it's good to have a couple of passionate people talking about it, and then to make sure that enough information reaches the higher-ups to make decisions about it. So the situation that students like Ardoin was describing to me is that there should be somebody addressing this, just not me. And that the person who should be addressing them should be intrinsically motivated, should have some internal passion about this. And if you weren't, then it wasn't necessarily your responsibility. This also had implications for whether or not these students saw a need to be knowledgeable about these issues. So Abigail was somebody who described to me that she didn't feel like sustainability was a big part of the culture at her business school. And this is what she said, I don't feel like I need to be knowledgeable about it at all. I feel like if at some point I'm in a company that says we want to be sustainable, go research it. I will come back in 2 days and say there are things that we need to do, and so it's not that hard. So again, it's not that these people are completely unaware of these issues, but it's just that because they see them as out of the scope of their role, they also felt like the skills and knowledge were not necessary to their profession. And of course, for those of us who actually work on sustainability issues, we can realize that this kind of reactive approach may not be enough to address the complexity of these kinds of issues. What we see from the qualitative data also matches with what I saw in the quantitative data on this topic. So one of the things I asked in the survey is, how important is it for business leaders to be knowledgeable about the following topics? So a number of business topics. And what's important here is that when I compare people's responses between those who think that it's more the responsibility of business or those who think that it's more the responsibility of government, the only topic that they rate differently is that of environmental sustainability. So one of the things that you might ask now is, what is happening during business schools that's actually shaping these views? And more critically, are people coming into business schools and leaving with the same views, or is something changing over time? So to look at this, I'm going to show you a subset of the data. On this side, I'm going to show you the responses of those who just started business school in the first 25% of their experience. And here I'm going to show you the percentage responses of those who are in the last 25% of their experience. So they're almost done. And I'm going to show you the percent of students who responded of what they perceived of the norm of their classmates. So what we see here is that the perception of the norm within their business schools is that it doesn't change when it comes to business. The percentage of people that students think that businesses are responsible doesn't change over time. So students who start think that about 12% are responsible, and they end at the same percentage level. But what we see over time is that there is a difference in the percentage of students who think their peers think that others think that it's about equal responsibility. And this difference largely comes from an increase in the percentage of students who think that it's the responsibility of government. Now, as you've seen, it's a little hard to explain. But one of the things I want to say here is that this actually tells you what people's perception of the norm is. If I were to show you the plot for what people's own perception is, it actually doesn't change over time. So this is interesting. It means that their own perceptions aren't changing, but their perceptions of the norm is changing over time. And given that people aren't talking about it very much, it actually implies that the norm, their perceptions of the norm is not changing because they're getting a lot of explicit cues about this, but rather this suggests that there's a strong default narrative that business schools might actually exacerbate over time. A default narrative that, for instance, might suggest this deep trade-off between corporate environmental performance and profit. And in many ways, this is consistent with other literature, for example, literature showing that people have lay theories about the fact that profit and making profit has to come out at a trade-off with social good, or other work showing that there is a dominant norm of self-interest, particularly in Western cultures. Now, This is not the most positive note. And so before leaving you, I wanted to also show you an alternative narrative that came up during some of the interviews I had. So this is not a view held by many students, but I want to show you this to show that it is possible to hold another view, even if it's not very prevalent. So for these students, they tended to see corporate environmental performance as something of a skill, something external to acquire rather than being driven by internal passions. So Sophia was a student that I talked to who used to work in a family business and then now was at business school and hoped to start her own company when she left. And to her, she says, hopefully in the future, especially since it's not a passion area for me, but I'm entering this space, I think the trend is starting to come up, but it's only been for the past maybe 5 or 6 years. Hopefully people will see it as less niche and more of a skills area. I'm personally seeing it as a skills area. So students like Sophia talked about corporate environmental performance as more akin to something like finance or accounting. You didn't necessarily study it because you're passionate about accounting, but rather because it's actually important to your job. This had implications for whether or not, of course, students saw corporate environmental performance as being relevant to their business roles. So Eric was somebody who was an international student who came to business school and said that he would have appreciated actually a little bit more exposure in business school to these issues. The reason is, I think that it's a role for probably everyone, really, from potential entrepreneurs to people who are potentially going to be higher up in big corporations to investors. I think these issues are those that would affect each of them in the way that they should be thinking about leadership in their different contexts. And so for these students, because it's not necessarily driven by internal passion, they were more likely to see how corporate environmental performance could be relevant to a number of different roles across an organization. Now, one way that I've been talking about this for most of the talk is looking at how corporate environmental performance behavior is driven by these internal versus external motivations. And then you might think from this data that these students just don't care at all about corporate environmental performance or about the environment in general. So I'm going to leave you with one last finding that suggests that, of course, the picture is more complex than that. And it's more complex because as it turns out, students seem to know a lot more about their personal behaviors and the impacts of their personal behaviors than they do about their professional actions. So one of the questions I asked in the survey was, how knowledgeable would you say that you are about each of the following topics? And I presented them with a number of business topics. For example, can they think of examples of businesses with strong financial performance? Do they know where to find out more about good and sustainable business practices? And on the whole, results kind of clustered together, with this on this side being less knowledgeable and this side being more knowledgeable. But the main point I want to make with these findings is that compared to what students know about their individual behaviors, they tend to know a lot more and significantly more. Now, the survey data can show, this quantitative difference, but actually when I talked to students about this topic, it illuminated that the cognitive difference is actually much greater. Basically, students saw environmental issues as really being in the personal domain and not within the professional domain. So Amanda, who has the last quotation of this section, she told me that she had wanted to be in business since she was in 8th grade. I have no idea how she knew that, but that was amazing, So when I talked to her and I asked her, okay, well, how do you think about corporate environmental performance and how do you think about the environment in business? She told me, they're like two separate spaces in my mind. And she took a long pause here. I still see the environmental issue as more of a social issue. It would be amazing if we could get the business world to engage in that effort, but I think it's going to be tough to get businesses that are completely focused on something different to engage. So almost every single student that I talked to, it's not that they didn't care about the environment at all. Most of them professed actually having pro-environmental values, caring about these outcomes, and caring about their own personal behaviors. But the point I want to make here is that even though they have these personal attitudes, the fact that they don't see it as relevant to their professional roles means that they're not bringing these ideas into their professional domain. Okay, so shown you a lot of findings. What do these all imply? I started off the talk by showing you these two questions. How do students understand their role and responsibility? And then how does business school actually shape these views? So what we can say about this is, first of all, it appears that business schools are not necessarily changing the views of business students when it comes to corporate environmental performance. If anything, they're actually pushing them in the other direction, away from thinking that it's their own responsibility. And the second thing is that while business schools do have this opportunity to provide external cues or other cues that might signify the importance and the responsibility for this, it doesn't appear that this is happening. So these studies give us insight into what people are thinking about, but of course, if we want to foster more corporate environmental performance, what do these findings suggest? I think it suggests two strategies, and these really fall along the lines of strategies through the individual and strategies through the environment. So within business schools, one strategy might be to increase the portion of MBAs with corporate environmental performance interests. And this is already starting to happen in a number of business schools through their admissions processes, for example. Another approach you could take, of course, is to actually try to change the meaning of business leadership itself. So for example, incorporating more of this material into curriculum, either through core or elective classes. And I think what's important to note here is that some work looking at how to spread social values within organizations has found that both of these strategies can work, and both of these strategies act as substitutes for each other. So I think that the overall point is that any strategy is probably better than no strategy, given the default of having no strategy on this. Of course, in doing this work, we also realized that the business school world is part of a much larger and complex ecosystem. So one of the joys of doing this work is that with Laura and others, we were able to publish some of the other findings from this survey in a study in advance of COP21, where it was featured in a number of publications around the world and also presented at the World Economic Forum. But one of the things to take away here is that our audience is not only business school students, but of course other people within this ecosystem. So of all of the management scholars in the world right now, only 4% of them are affiliated with the organizations and natural environment subdivision, which is something to think about, given that we know that these issues are going to affect every aspect of business. So there's work to be done at every level, not just MBAs, but also with deans, administrators, and faculty. There are also implications, of course, for businesses. If you want to integrate corporate environmental performance, you might take a similar approach, the individual or the environment. So for example, if you want to build in more of this engagement, you might create a CSR department that's isolated within your company and pushes CP out through this department. Or you might think about incorporating performance metrics across a number of roles across the organization as a way to drive more corporate environmental performance. Okay, so I've shown you a lot today, and we're getting to the end. And so I want to leave you with one quotation that I think captures a lot of the ideas that I posed. And this is by Ernst Hotzel at Google. He says, "The science tells us that tackling climate change is an urgent global priority. We believe the private sector, in partnership with policy leaders, must take bold steps, and that we can do so in a way that leads to growth and opportunity. And we have a responsibility to do so, to our users and the environment. In many ways, sustainability is one of the biggest challenges of our time. So where better to start than at the very beginning of the business leadership pipeline? Here lies this incredible opportunity to not only influence these future business leaders, but all of the organizations that they fan out to afterwards. So we have this opportunity here to ensure that the next generation of business leaders come to business school seeking skills and knowledge, but also leave thinking that there is a role for business in addressing corporate environmental performance, a role whose responsibility includes bringing benefits to both businesses and to the planet." Thank you.
I like that applause says a lot. I'm Sarah Billington, I'm chairing the committee, so it's open now to questions from the audience.
Thanks so much for your presentation. This is fantastic. I really enjoyed both the integration of several different methods into understanding this complex and super important question. One thought that came to mind as you're discussing sustainability as this skill set, could you speak a little bit more as to what that might actually look like in a curriculum and what types of things students need to be exposed to?
Yeah, so this is a great question, and actually I think it's being debated a lot within management scholarship right now. So I think the challenge, of course, is that sustainability has impacts across, you can list all of your core classes, and it could be integrated in some way. So a lot of people have discussed, one of the things we can do is create context or case studies that have environmental issues as like the issue around which we're discussing. But I think there's also, I can just give you an example. Like when we think about accounting, how do we actually account for environmental costs, and how do we account for certain externalities? When we think about risk, how do we quantify risk, especially given the uncertainty in this domain? So I think the question that I would kind of pose back to the management community is that given that only 4% of them are actually affiliated with this domain, it's clear that there's a lack of overlap in the kind of knowledge. So I think it might require a lot of collaboration to start developing all these materials in order to kind of fan it out across all of these topics.
So I have a question about, I noticed you offered that alternative narrative, and Sophia, I noticed, worked in a clean tech company before. And you mentioned at the very beginning, when you're showing us the characteristics of your sample, that some of these things, like the number of years when you did business prior, et cetera, didn't matter. Did you see a difference with respect to how people saw sustainability issues as a skill set versus as an internal communicational aspect of who they are by what they had done before going to school?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So in preparing for the dissertation, I went back through and looked at all the data again. And one of the things that I remembered is that, so for students who, for example, are studying environmental sustainability or who had worked in companies that had more corporate environmental performance, some of them tended to think that it was more of a skill set, but actually this narrative about passion and about intrinsic motivation is not just for people who don't care about it. It's also that, in fact, a lot of people who do work in it do really care, and so for them it is this self-reinforcing notion. But I think that I think a lot of it is about how you frame these issues. So people like Sophia, even though she had worked in clean tech, I think she came to see more opportunities to do so. And I think there were also a number of people in her organization who were not intrinsically motivated, so she had models.
Yes, I found your research really compelling, and I'm the director of oral communication at a business college right down the road, and it's undergrads. And one difficulty that comes up when I give presentations and teach classes there is students' question or curiosity about what success looks like in business. And they point to individuals in our society and politics who are successful, and they do unfortunately bring up Trump as an example of somebody who's supposedly incredibly successful and very empathetic to any environmental protections. So I'm curious how to persuade undergrads that this matters when they see and look at definitions of success that are so opposite of what we're going to achieve here.
Well, I think the question you're asking is a huge, huge issue, and certainly, my findings can't speak to that specifically. But I can tell you a story, actually. When I first started doing these pilot interviews, one of the questions that I would ask students is, what do you think success means as a business person? And also, what is the role of business in society? And students couldn't answer this question. A lot of them told me, I've never thought about this. They were, they had been in business school for 2 years, like, I don't know, I've never thought about this before. Oh, this is interesting. And so it was interesting, but it made for interesting data. I was like, what do I do with this? Okay. So I actually went back and I talked to Len about this, and I told Len, maybe it's too much to expect these students to know. And his reply to me was, Jen, if you ask law students what the purpose of law in society is, they would have an answer. I was like, oh yeah, good point. Oh yeah. And so I think actually maybe one way to answer the question is that it seems like more broadly we're kind of lacking a central philosophy or thesis about the role of business in society and also what that means in terms of responsibility. So I think that that's kind of a larger way of saying that's probably the first order question. Noah?
Yeah, I really enjoyed the talk. Thank you. I've got a couple questions about hypothesis testing, and I guess they're related. One is, how do you test the significance between that lower quartile of business school experience and upper quartile? And related, when you showed for the two sort of tail, you had three categories, and you had your left and right tails of that, and you compared with the respondents overall, that red line, which I think to be like the mean of the respondents overall. But you were asking a question about perception of your peers, and the peers are presumably within an individual business school environment. So how do you distinguish between the answer to my peers, my local peers, but you're comparing with the whole population?
Yeah, so to answer the second question, so I guess one of the things that I mentioned is that, so when I look at these results overall by business school and by region, we see very similar trends in terms of overestimation of certain beliefs of their peers. And so, and the fact that there isn't regional variation and there isn't variation along these other lines, one of the things that I thought about a lot is you might expect there to be differences between different business schools, but actually on the whole it appears that these trends are very similar, which suggests that maybe the differences between students is not, or rather that the culture of business school is globalized in such a way to be more similar than the differences you might expect by region. And so that's one thing. And then secondly, yeah, for all of the tests within the presentation that I showed you, I'm using oftentimes proportion tests and then using Bonferroni corrections to adjust for them.
So the one where you have two data points and a straight line between them.
Yeah.
Do you have a significance test for
Which one?
You're comparing the upper quartile of experience in business school and lower quartile.
Yeah. What was your question? Sorry.
How are you testing the significance between them?
I'm testing them by testing the difference in proportions. Yeah, across the two populations. So I'm bucketing by the subpopulation and testing to see if the proportion is significantly different between the two. Yeah, so it's not significant for the flat line and then significant for the other two. Yeah. Chris?
It's about your insights on pathways for change, and I can imagine three different hypotheses that you have insights on. One is sort of pull from the curriculum. The second is push from the students for changing the curriculum. And the third is that the students do stuff that's kind of independent of the curriculum, and they self-organize around changing what they do. And what's the relative importance of things, and how each of the actors perceive it?
So I think the first response is that's probably an empirical question on some level. So I can't speak specifically to that. I think to the third strategy, so you talk about self-organization within students, that's something that I did think about when I was looking at this data. And the reason is that from talking to students and also from looking at some of the survey data, it appears to be self-clustering along these interests. And on the one hand, that's really good because it gives them the opportunity to reinforce these norms and then actually. On the other hand, it leads to these isolated pockets, such that if you're somebody who doesn't already engage with these issues, you're less likely to engage with them because you're not interacting in a social sphere with them. Or you might be interacting with these people, but you're just not talking about it. So I guess to me, in thinking about these three things relative to each other, yeah, I don't know. I think it's a hard question. I think we need to probably move along all of them at the same time. But I would say that in terms of what business schools can do, I would say that the easiest thing is probably to increase the proportion of students who are interested in it if we're looking at ease. And then the hardest thing is actually to try to change this idea of business leadership. But yeah, either way, I think for me, the relative benchmark is doing nothing. And so, yeah, I'm not sure. I think that's an avenue for future research.
Was there still a question in the back?
Thanks. You mentioned that framing is really important So given that there are so many different ways to talk about this in the business sector, CEP, CSR, CSV, how did you think about that framing when you were doing your studies and surveys? You know, in terms of framing, in terms of responsibility versus opportunity?
So I think maybe one way to get at this more fundamentally is that when I first started doing these pilot interviews and I was talking to students about these issues, people don't have good language around which they themselves describe this. And so students will use a number of terms, but often fail to be able to give concrete examples of this within a corporate domain. And so, oftentimes when I talk to students, in the interviews themselves, I tended to let them define it for themselves first, and then I would use that terminology throughout the interviews. And then for the global survey, working with Laura and others, we used language from other surveys that had previously been done with CEOs in order to create a benchmark. But I would say overall, this kind of goes to this other question, that in general, there's not a common terminology or a common philosophy that people can anchor on and then have this dialogue together. So that might be an important thing to think about in the future as well.
Maybe just have one last question, and then did you want?
Yeah,
And then she has some acknowledgements, but we're just at 11.
It's another pathway for change, the legal model, the charismatic leader, Paul management. Do you have any evidence that it is changing norms?
Yeah, so there's some research that shows that particularly leaders can have a significant effect on their organization. And I think it's working through two different mechanisms. So one is that they themselves are changing the external perception of how the importance of sustainability within an organization, et cetera. But also they tend to put in different organizational structures that then make it possible for these things to happen. And I think increasingly, sort of at a global scale, we're seeing companies create more networks and increase norms around sustainability. But I would say that overall, there's two questions. So one is, how prevalent is that? So even with all of the action today, only 103 companies around the world have science-based benchmarks for emissions. So there's still a long way to go. And then secondly, you can say all these things at the top, but does it actually trickle down across your organization? And I think that's really individually dependent. Yeah, okay, acknowledgements. Okay, I have so many. Okay, so one of the things I wanted to say before I got into acknowledgements is that, as Nicole mentioned, I've done a lot of different things at Stanford, so this is just one aspect or facet of my experience here. And in many ways, being at Stanford has allowed me to achieve a number of dreams, actually. So these dreams involved going and working for the NRDC and then working for the Behavioral Insights team in London, which I had first read about in a New York Times article and then decided I wanted to work there, and somehow that happened. I had the chance to class and then also perform with fellow musicians, even though it's not my professional job. And then finally, actually more fundamentally, I think you had asked me 10 years ago, Jen, you're gonna study psychology and behavioral science. I would have said, no way. I studied molecular biology in undergrad. But this book is a book that I read when I was about 13. And I was so fascinated by this. Should have been an indication. And I had the opportunity to take classes from people who I'd only seen on the covers of books. I mean, it's just been amazing. So of course, to do this kind of work and to do a PhD, it's not just the actions of one person, but involves a lot of other people. And so first I wanted to thank my committee. So Dale is back there. Dale is, if you ever have a chance to talk with him, do. His wisdom is only outmatched by his kindness, and he has this amazing ability to take anything, like any piece of research, anything in the news, any person, and find the most fascinating thing about them that you didn't even see there before. And who else would have taken this strange little E-IPER bird under his wing and then walked her through this experience until now? So thank you, Dale. Nicole, for those of you who don't know, won a volunteer award at Stanford this week for basically combining volunteer service with her scholarship. And I think that's super exemplary of who Nicole is. Not only is she this amazing scholar, but is always tying it back to impact in the community. And so she's really been a model of engaged scholarship for me. Thank you. Oh, oops. Len? Okay, so Len, after my first year at Stanford, I went to him. I said, Len, I don't know what I'm doing. Like, I don't know what I'm going to study. And he said, Jen, I'm not, anybody who saw you at the beginning would know that it would take you a little bit of time to figure this out. And so don't worry. And really, in many ways, Len is the person who licensed me and allowed me to switch over into the behavioral sciences starting in my second year. So thank you, Len. Carrie I met actually a year before I even started at Stanford at the Behavior, Energy, and Climate Change Conference. And at that conference, we talked about the nest thermostat all the way to like how we grew up and were raised. And so over the years, I've just been so fortunate to have a range of conversations with Carrie and to be privy to her advice. So thank you, Carrie. And then Sarah, thank you so much for chairing. I got to know Sarah when we were sitting on the Dean Search Committee. And Sarah has this amazing ability during these committees to ask questions I had in my mind, but was too intimidated to ask. So thank you, Sarah, for correcting my own pluralistic ignorance and for being here today. Okay, obviously, there's so many people who make a day like this happen. To the E-IPER staff, oh my gosh, I didn't even know what was involved in putting together a defense. Thank you for guiding me through this and over the years for just shepherding me along this path. I received funding from a number of centers that I'm really grateful for and had so many different labs on campus, both labs with my advisors, labs at places like CMU, and also labs that I started with people like Greg Sparkman in the psychology department. And then, of course, I want to thank my collaborators. So first, I want to point out Priya, who's standing at the back and has to run to teach a class. Priya comforted me when the interviews went poorly and really made me laugh when they went well, helped me in many ways understand this experience in a way that very few people could have. She's also a master storyteller, so if you enjoyed hearing about MBAs for an hour, a lot of it can be thanks to Priya. There are a number of other collaborators that I worked with closely over the years, including undergraduate researchers, people who helped me TA the classes I taught. And so to all of those people, thank you so, so, so much. And then, of course, all the people that talked with me and filled out my surveys. I also wanted to mention that, yeah, again, I don't think it's everybody's idea of like the best time to just talk about MBAs for hours on end. And so there were a number of people who helped me prepare this presentation, including Nicole's lab group, the E-IPER group, Dale's lab group, Bella and Joe, Philip and Michael, Priya, Glenn. Thank you all. And then finally, it's been a pretty moment for me, and I've just received support in so many ways and in so many domains of my life. And so to all of you, thank you so much for all the messages, for all of the support, for helping me make sense of my life. Thank you. Okay, and then finally, and most importantly, my family. So first I'm going to point out Jessie, who's sitting right there. So Jessie is my younger sister. She's been very passionate about, all of the things that she's been doing and so generous in her kindness and taking interest in my life, of course. So here she is at the Young Environmental Scholars Conference asking very thoughtful questions. She was also one of the last people there. Actually, she was the last person there. Here she is at the end. But no worries, her enthusiasm will always win out as she snacked on things afterwards. So Jessie, I love you so much, and I'm so proud of you. Of course, being the older sister, you think that you're always going to know best, but yeah, this is a picture of her picking me up at the airport, or me picking her up at the airport and then needing to lean on her because I'm so tired. And then finally, to my whole family, my parents, Lily and Ree, who are sitting here and who came from Canada here, from when I was growing up up until this morning. You've always just been this incredible source of support. And I always think that I'm doing this interdisciplinary stuff, I'm trying to do stuff that's new and innovative, but really if you really want to talk to people who are interdisciplinary, please, if you get a chance, talk to my parents. Both of my parents are just these amazing people who have had multiple careers while having one main career. And they've also been the people who have time and time again always showed me how important it is to tie what the work you're doing is to real world impact, to try to really make sure that you're making a difference and also making a difference for those around you. So thank you so much. Cheers.